Welcome to our series, Faithful Regardless, a study of the book of 1 Samuel. The book of 1 Samuel has just shown us some tremendous characters, tremendous men and women who have been faithful to God regardless of circumstances, and also some that were not. Last week we met David, King David, as just a young boy, anointed by Samuel. And his first course of action was when he played the harp for Saul, when Saul was overcome with stress and anxiety and said actually an evil spirit sent from God was tormenting him. And the only thing that would give him peace and relief was when David played the harp for him. Now this week is probably the most famous story of David, one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible, and it's called David and Goliath. So we pick it up because last week we saw how David was filled with the Spirit of God just when he was anointed with oil by Samuel as the next king. And this seemed to be somewhat of a secret because it wasn't really put into play until 15 years later when he finally became king. But he was back to being a shepherd boy, actually the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse. And he was bringing peace to this situation because of the Spirit of the Lord upon him. What we learned was that we need to do the same thing, bring peace to a situation because of the Spirit of the Lord in us, love and peace and joy and what we have. Now this week, we see David in a different light. He becomes a warrior, in fact, a fierce warrior against an enemy that no one would even stand up against, Goliath. And we pick it up in 1 Samuel 17. We're going to go starting with verse 4 all the way through verse 50, so fasten your seatbelts and listen to this story. Now, I want to say this, though, before we start. You hear David and Goliath, and you think, oh, I've heard that story ever since I was a kid. I know everything about it. Well, I want you to do this. Don't let the story become so familiar that you miss out on the opportunity to learn something new. Perhaps the Lord will speak something new to you about this that you can apply to your life. Perhaps something that you haven't really focused on before. So once again, 1 Samuel 17, verses 4 through 50. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Now, right away, we saw some units of measurement of weight that we're not familiar with, shekels. And basically this, his spearhead was about 17 pounds, just the spearhead. And then his scale armor alone was about 125 pounds. I'm guessing that David did not even weigh that much at this point. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why don't you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. And then the Philistine said, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse. He was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. The first one was Eliab, the second one was Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. All right, so you see what's happening here. David's 3 older brothers are part of the military campaign of Saul, but they're doing nothing. All they're doing is being taunted by this giant enemy named Goliath, a Philistine champion named Goliath. Saul and his brave warriors are doing nothing but receiving insults from someone who is defying the living God of Israel. David, on the other hand, is just a gopher, a messenger boy, or someone who would just bring food or supplies to the front line. The front line is on the Valley of Elah. The Valley of Elah is still there, by the way. It's a valley about a half hour southwest of Jerusalem. And you can go there and you can see the cliffs on either side. And there's a long valley. And you know what's interesting? You go down to the valley and guess what there's a multitude of? Smooth stones. Verse 20, early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed him. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and ran to the battle lines and asked his brother how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. And whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now you see that David was observing what is going on here at the battlefront. He wasn't liking it. Verse 25, now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from paying taxes in Israel. David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. Well, verse 28, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Pause here. David's brother Eliab was a piece of work. He did not see David had a heart after God. He didn't see his brother for who he was. He had jealousy. He had hatred towards him. And he is questioning the motives for even being there. And meanwhile, David is being filled with a righteous anger that will prove to be one of the most victorious moments in the entire Bible, of all the battles. Verse 29, now what have I done, said David. Can I even speak? He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go up and fight him. Saul replied, you are not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the army of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. Saul said to David, go, the Lord be with you. All right, so you see David recounted some of his experiences about shepherding in the wilderness. Lions, bears would come out and attack the sheep, and he would literally pull them from the mouth and hold the bear or the lion by the hair and strike it either with a club or something and cause it to be released. And when it turned on him, he fought it off and killed them. He was telling Saul his experiences of battle, and he said, this uncircumcised Philistine who is defying the armies of the living God is nothing compared to that. So Saul was convinced. Now, it's interesting. Why was Saul convinced? He's still just a boy. Was Saul just willing to put armor on anyone and send anyone out there to fight? Because there was no one at this point who would even agree to go and face Goliath. And David was perhaps the first. But Saul said, go, and the Lord be with you. Verse 38 says, then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head, and David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. All right, so instead of Saul going to battle himself, he dresses up David, and he tries to make David wear his armor as if to have some part of this battle. Perhaps he believed that David might have an outside chance of surviving this battle, and he wanted his mark on it. But that didn't work for David. The armor and the sword and the tunic were cumbersome. David couldn't even walk. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand. He chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in a pouch of his shepherd bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Verse 41, meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and said he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. And he said to David, am I a dog that you are to come out at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. And David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. He made the same threat to Goliath that Goliath made to him. I'll give your body to the wild animals and the birds. Well, here it happens. Verse 47. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. All right, let's stop right there. Greatest hand-to-hand combat in the history of the Bible. I mean, you don't see anything more prolific and symbolic than this. David and Goliath. David's still a young boy. Goliath, a 9-foot giant who had 125 pounds of armor on him. I don't know how much he weighed, but he was a giant. And so when we hear this story, it's always a wonderful adventure story. And we always, in our minds and hearts, we clap at the end because David was victorious. But we have to look at this as we would any other passage of the Bible and say, what can we learn from it? What is the Lord speaking to us through this, the story of David and Goliath? And there's 3 things I want you to ask yourself. Who is your Goliath, or what is your Goliath? That's one. The next one, what is Saul's armor, or Saul's armor and sword to you? That's 2. And the third one is, what is your stone? What is your stone? And we'll get to that one. First, what is your Goliath? Your Goliath is the thing that you're facing. It's probably not a giant person who's going to kill you and throw your flesh to the birds and the animals. Your Goliath is probably a seemingly impossible situation, a health crisis, some fear or a depression or some adversary that directly threatens you and is imposing and intimidating you. And your Goliath could be something in your life that seems to represent your defeat or demise, or something that others fear and either run away from or just succumb to. It could be your Goliath. Whatever it is in your life, you need to approach that Goliath in faith and courage, not fear and doubt. You need to know that God is bigger and more powerful than any enemy we face, and it's his battle, not ours. Ephesians 6:10 says this, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. And I believe as we look at these other 2 questions, you'll see how his power is manifest and put into action to help us to overcome the Goliaths that we face. Sometimes we face every day. The second question I asked was, what are Saul's armor and sword in your life? What represents Saul's armor and sword? Now, it's armor is representative of the methods and the practices and the traditions of someone else. Someone else's way of coping, someone else's way of trying to overcome. Perhaps they work for somebody else's battle, but they're not yours. And not only are they not yours, but they're ineffective and maybe even cumbersome. They may make you feel important to have the king's armor, maybe even make you feel like you're part of something greater than you are, but they're not what God has for you. Saul's armor represents something that is not what God has given you, but something someone else has given you or you have acquired and ultimately it makes you more vulnerable and less protected. Saul's armor is a temptation to do the things the way we want to do them, not God's way. Or to not take what God has given you, but try to pull something that's not been given to you. Sometimes it's relying on man-made strength and methods and not the Lord's. Sometimes we grasp for external things to try to make us appear stronger or more formidable than we really are, because no one wants to look weak. So sometimes the idea of putting armor on us, especially king's armor, makes us at least look like we're more formidable or stronger or more confident, when inside we're not. And sometimes we hide behind Saul's armor. Sometimes it's the defense mechanisms or the weapons that we react with that help us defend ourselves. And God wants us to not walk in that armor. God wants to clothe us with what He has given us. He wants us to go forth even if we look weak and appear small to our adversary, because of how God works. You see, David looked very weak. He looked very vulnerable to Goliath. But he was not. 2 Corinthians 12:9 and 10 says, His strength is made perfect in our weakness. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Friends, that is our strength. According to Paul in 2 Corinthians, he says that my strength is my weakness. Because when I'm not trying to do things my way, when I'm not pulling from things that are external, that are man-made, when I'm not pulling from my own resources and my own protections, I'm clearly reliant on God. And that is a perfect place to be. Relying on God for our strength, not on Saul's armor. And the last question I asked you was, what is your stone? I'm referring to the smooth stone that David put in his slingshot and slung into giant Goliath's forehead and caused him to fall face down on the ground, and David went and killed him. What is that? What is that thing that will be the most effective tool or the most effective weapon in your arsenal, the most effective thing? Your stone, I believe, represents your faith in God. It's the one thing that God uses against all odds to bring victory. It's the thing that seems like, it's no match for the weaponry that's coming against you, yet it always proves effective. It always proves victorious. Your stone is faith in action. It doesn't need much, but it's powerful enough to drop any Goliath. You see, David could have collected, instead of 5 smooth stones, he could have went out and collected 5 big rocks and had them in his shepherd's bags or something like that. He could have went out and collected the most, jagged-edged stones that he could find, and they themselves would become very fierce weapons. But for whatever reason, he collected 5 smooth stones. 5 smooth stones. Because he knew that's all he needed. Because it wasn't really the stone itself that's going to kill the giant. It's God's power within him and working through him through the faith in God. He was relying on God for this victory, not his stones. Now, was he prepared? Yes, he was. He had more than enough stones. He had his sling. He even had his staff, because Goliath said, "You're coming at me with that stick." But it wasn't his slingshot marksmanship that won the battle. Because if he was just relying on his skill without his trust in God, I'm going to do this alone, I think the story would have ended much differently. David had faced adversaries before, but even then he told us it wasn't so much him, but that God delivered him. We read it in verse 36 and 37. It says, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." Now it sounds like he's bragging that he did it on his own. But here's what he says in the next verse. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine." You see how David trusted God. He was relying on God. I hope that you get that part of it. David gives full credit to God for this victory over these wild animals, but not himself. And he has learned to rely on and operate in complete trust in God. That's what it's like to have a heart after God. And David has shown that time and time again. In fact, his message to Saul wasn't, trust me because I can do this. His message to Saul was, trust God who has proven himself, and I've seen it. Trust God. Trust is the key to David's victory. And I want to tell you something, and I've said this many times before, but you need to know it, that trust is faith, and faith is trust. It's the same word. Faith in God, trust in God. David had no sword, he had no spear, he had no javelin, he had no helmet, he had no breastplate. Goliath had giant versions of all these things. But David came in power and protection because of his faith in the Lord. He came in the name of the Lord. Verse 45, it says, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. Now, friends, many of us are facing Goliaths, even today. Some of you are facing very serious threats in your life. Perhaps in your job, you don't know what's going to happen. Perhaps in your family, you're in excruciating insecurity about their welfare or the welfare of your family. Perhaps your health. You're facing something, colossal challenge you never thought you might, or someone else is. Maybe it's your mental health or your physical health. Maybe your finances. Maybe your spiritual life. You just feel like you're getting threatened, pounded away, and you're losing your spiritual equilibrium and health. Well, our normal response is to just do everything we can to rectify the situation and protect ourselves. But God wants to give you victory, but only if you trust him and not your own resources and your own strength. Because he'll give you the wisdom, he'll give you the power, he'll give you the courage to overcome the Goliath, even if it's health and depression and fear and finances and family and anything else. He'll give you that. He'll provide a way where there is no way, or give you the abundance of grace to endure it, as he did Paul. But your temptation will be to go it alone. Your temptation will be to wear Saul's armor and just start hacking away at the giant as hard as you can with someone else's sword, instead of trusting the Lord with all your heart. And I urge you, don't fall into that trap. In fact, Solomon says in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding or your strength. The only way for victory is to trust God. Think of the Goliaths you're facing now. Ask God to help you trust him as you face them. Be willing to relinquish your own methods, your own understanding, and fully trust in God's. Remember what David said, verse 47, it's not by spear that the Lord saves, but the battle is the Lord. So turn over your fear, your anxiety, your doubt. Turn over to God and let him fight for you. I often think about this, is when the children of Israel were leaving Egypt in Exodus, I'm closing with this, they're being chased down by not just a Goliath. It's one thing if there's a Goliath running after them, but they were slaves and they're pinned up against the Red Sea. They're being chased down by the most powerful army in the world. And not just army, but an army with chariots and horses coming after them to either kill them or drag them back to Egypt as slaves. And Moses' message to them was not, grab anything you can and start fighting away. No. Moses' message to them is the same message to us, no matter how many giants or any enemies that we face. And it's this. Exodus 14, 13 and 14. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. I believe the Lord fought for David. He just needed to trust God. The Lord directed that stone to exactly where it needed to be to overcome the Goliath, and he could do the same for you. All you need to do is be still and trust in his strength and not your own. God bless you.